Homework 4, number 5. Write a Raptor algorithm that analyzes the performance of baseball players in the Major League. Your algorithm will repeatedly ask for a player name followed by the number of RBIs until the word "end" is provided for the player's name. Your algorithm will then output the names of all the players that were within plus or minus 10 RBIs of the average number of RBIs. There is no limit to the number of players that may be entered, but you may assume that the user will input at least one player. To design this algorithm, we'll first note that we have two inputs, player name and RBIs. We'll also see that the player name and RBIs, we're going to get those multiple times. So each of these inputs will be array values, and we'll get them until the value "end" is entered. We'll call our first input names. The second one we'll call RBIs. Next we have one output. Specifically, it's the names of the players that were within plus or minus 10 RBIs of the average number of RBIs. But before we can find the players close to the average, we'll also have to calculate the average. So looking at the algorithm, it looks like we have three steps. First, we're going to get inputs. Next, we'll need to calculate the average. And then lastly, output names of players close to the average. Now we're ready to implement these steps in Raptor. We have 3 steps, so I'll do 3 calls. First call, get inputs. Second call, calculate average. And the third call, output names close to average. Now we'll implement get inputs. Essentially, we're going to get inputs inside of a loop. So we'll set our loop, not forgetting our assignment for initialize and modify. We'll initialize I to 1. We'll modify by setting I to I plus 1. And then inside the loop, we're going to get an input. We'll ask the user, what's the player's name? And we'll store that value in a variable called temp name. Then our exit condition will check temp name against the value "end." If temp name is "end", then we've gotten our last input and we'll exit. But if it's not "end", then we want to store the value temp name into our names array. So names I will be temp name. By doing it this way, by getting a temporary name, instead of putting it directly into our array, we're able to check to make sure that that value is not "end". And this prevents "end" from ending up in our array. So if the user types in "end", it exits before we store the value inside the array. But if it's not "end", we'll store that name inside of the names array. Once we've stored the name in the names array, we have another input. What's the player's RBI? And we'll store that value in an array, RBIs. We can test our get inputs function by trying some sample values. Ruth 171, Gehrig 184, and then end. We can see that it stopped taking inputs when I typed in end, and also I can look inside of my two arrays, names and RBIs, and it matches what I typed in. So our get inputs is working correctly. It stops taking inputs when I type in end, and it stores the values that I typed in into the names and the RBIs arrays. Moving on to calculate average, we're essentially going to go through the array, keeping track of a running total, and at the end we'll take our running total and we'll divide it by the number of values in the array. So since we have to go through each value in the RBIs array, we'll set up a loop, not forgetting our assignments for initialize and modify. We'll set I to 1. We'll modify by setting I to I plus 1. Our exit condition will be when I is greater than the length of the array that we're going to be looking at, which is RBIs. We mentioned that we need to keep track of a running total, so we need another variable. We'll set running total to the value 0. And then as we go through each value in the array, we're going to take the value and we're going to add it to our running total. So our execute step will be running total is going to be set to running total plus RBIs I. We have our running total, but we want to calculate an average. So at the end of the loop, we'll add an assignment to calculate the average, which is going to be running total divided by the number of players, which we can do length of names. So here we have the average will be the value running total divided by the length of names. We can test our function so far by adding in some test values. Ruth 171 and lastly Derek 184. You see that the average is 182. It doesn't output the average, but it does calculate it, and 182 is the average of the numbers 191, 171, and 184. So it looks like we're calculating the average correctly. Moving on to output names close to average. If we think about all the potential numerical values that we could get, they'd fall somewhere along a number line, where this is the low value and that's the high value. And somewhere in between is the average. And what we're wanting to do is output all the names that are less than the average plus 10, but more than the average minus 10. So let's see how we would do that in Raptor. First, we have to go through each value in the names array and in the RBIs array. So we're going to add a loop, not forgetting our assignments for initialize and modify. Set I, initialize I to 1, and we'll set I to I plus 1 for modify. And we want to go through each value in the loop, so our exit condition is I greater than length of names. Now we know what the average is, so every time we go through the loop, we'll see if the RBI that we're looking at, RBI's I, is less than or equal to the average plus 10. And that'll capture all the values that are less than the average plus 10. But we also need to have those values to be greater than average minus 10. So this selection, RBIs less than or equal to average plus 10 and RBIs greater than or equal to average minus 10, will ensure that we're only getting those players whose average falls within the range average plus 10, average minus 10. So if the RBI does fall within that range, we simply want to output the name at that position. So we'll output names at the position I. This should be all that's required, so let's test our algorithm and see how that works. What is the players' names? Wilson, 191, Ruth, 171, Gehrig, 184. And we output Wilson and Gehrig. Some common errors might be using less than when we should have used less than or equal to. I knew that I needed to use less than or equal to because the problem specification said 10 RBIs inclusive. If it hadn't have said that, or if it had said exclusive, then I wouldn't have wanted to include the RBIs where they were equal to the average, in which case less than and greater than would have been correct. Let's test our algorithm against the test server and see how it goes. Looks like all of our test cases are correct, and so it appears as though our algorithm is working correctly.